A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
A different sort of dimension to manoeuvre into today, and some might say a sensitive place to be, because when a couple goes through infertility, all of the focus typically goes onto the mother, the woman. Well, let's get our attention onto the man today and the challenging time that it is when infertility shows its head. Sheridan Voysey has just released a 90-day devotional for couples navigating the difficult path of infertility. It's called Praying Through Infertility, a 90-day devotional for men and women. Sheridan is an author, a speaker, a broadcaster, and he's been through this journey over many, many years now and grappling with all of the dimensions of infertility. Sheridan is on the line with us from the UK. Sheridan, welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you, Neil. Always is.
Sheridan, let's talk about men, because my suspicion is men are overlooked. You're a man with this experience. What are the things going through your mind when you reflect on what's gone on and other men who are dealing with infertility?
Well, Neil, thank you firstly for raising this particular issue, because there was a bit of research done here in the UK a few years ago, and it found what everybody kind of knew to be true, but they were able to put it into clinical words, is that when it comes to infertility, the man in the couple is completely ignored the whole way through. So it's considered to be, quote unquote, a female's issue. And then when the couple go to the doctor focuses on the woman and her experience. And understandably so, because she will be the one who bears the child. So understandably so. And yet there is another half in that couple who traditionally have been completely ignored. And they found that infertility affects a man's self-esteem, can even affect his income in the end because it affects his work life, affects his relationship with his spouse, his wife, his partner. It affects so many aspects of a man's well-being, and they've generally been completely ignored. Even though, of course, infertility, it can actually be a male factor, not necessarily a female factor. So I'm so glad you've raised this issue, because poor old men in this particular conversation almost always get ignored.
Isn't it the case that when we think of our life's journey through being a child to a teenager to becoming a man and then marrying and having a family in the traditional sense, there's a sense in which if it doesn't all go right, then your manhood can come into question. Is that the way you think it affects a lot of men?
Very, very much so. There is something culturally that we have kind of linked masculinity and the ability to sire a child so tightly. And this is where I'm really grateful for the gospel. And this is why I'm really grateful for Jesus. And I'm really grateful for the Apostle Paul, who basically start really busting all of those myths. But it's there in our culture that the whole idea is, well, yes, you get married, then you have children, and that's the way that a man kind of progresses. In fact, I once saw somebody on Twitter who said exactly that. He said the way of a man is that you grow up, you get married, you have children, that's just what it is. And then he ended his tweet with the hashtag man up. And I thought to myself, of all the faithful men who had been faithful to their spouses, who had been faithful to their families, who were serving their churches, but I knew that they didn't have children, and I knew that they'd confessed to me how that made them feel. And here's this guy going around tweeting these kinds of things. But of course, that guy was only tweeting what sometimes is just there in the culture, not just in our broader secular culture, but in our church culture as well, that the idea is if you're going to be a man, you've got to get married, you've got to have kids.
It might be a seeking of just making a popular statement. It might be something that comes from ignorance. And I think that you're probably recognising those things more than anyone else who's not really thought through these issues. But when we, as Christians, start to think of a biblical foundation here, how do you reflect on some of the characters from the Bible who never did have children? Any thoughts here?
Well, there's quite a few. And this is the wonderful thing about having a variety of people participate in this book, Praying Through Infertility. We got 37 contributors from nearly 10 countries. And so some of our African contributors, they really brought a new edge to this conversation because in some of their cultures, both church and secular, you are considered quote unquote cursed if you don't have children. And there's one really powerful devotional in there by Sikambube, who has written this passage about John the Baptist's parents, Zachariah and Elizabeth. And it says that they were righteous in the sight of God, but they didn't have children. And I would have completely missed that little bit. And he said, hang on a sec. They didn't have children, but what did God say about them beforehand? They were righteous in the sight of God. So the scripture is wonderful about challenging these kinds of notions. Jesus was single in his 30s. And if we know anything about the cultural milieu at the time, he would have been looked at sideways by a few people. The idea back then was you were definitely married off by the time you were in your 20s, maybe even earlier than that, and you certainly had a family by the time you were reaching your 30s. So Jesus is single, he is childless, and does anybody want to call him cursed as a result of that? Does anybody want to say he's any lack of a man? What about the Apostle Paul? We think, the scholars think that he was married at one stage. We're not too sure what happened to the marriage, but we almost certainly, nobody knows for sure, but the scholars think that he was probably childless as well. Was Paul any less of a man because he wasn't able to have children? No, in Corinthians, he actually says, I would rather that you stayed single for the sake of the gospel. So we've got these wonderful alternative forces that are helping us to be freed from these myths of masculinity and indeed femininity that says you have to do this, this, and this, otherwise you're not a true man, not a true woman.
If we think of the calling on a man's life, and I'm talking generally, all men are called, to be disciples of Christ and to serve him in whatever capacity we have. We might think that a man in his capacity with a wife and family has a real priority to those children, and there's a sort of a first-tier ministry responsibility. If you don't have that first-tier ministry responsibility, is it just the fact that your calling is in a different way? It's not less, but it's a different calling that you're called to.
Oh, very much so, yeah. We don't want to be misunderstood here and somehow say, well, I don't think having family or marriage or children is a very important thing. I don't think Paul was saying that either. He was just saying, look, I'm a man who is absolutely driven by a missional impulse to get the gospel out to as many people as possible. And the way I see it, being single is the best way to go and do that. So I want you to all come and be like me. But it's not. Of course, being married is a holy, holy calling. Having children is a holy calling. So it turns out to be is being single. And so it turns out to be is maybe being childless. Now, I'd never thought about that before because it tends to be a binary choice. You have children, you don't. And if you don't, well then, gosh, somehow you've missed out. Could it well be that there really is a calling from God for certain couples to be childless, either by choice or indeed by circumstance?
Undoubtedly, when you are in a couple and that news comes from the doctor, I'm sorry, you won't be able to have children. You go through the roller coaster, all the possibilities, and then you're really faced with the ultimatum. Really, we've got to navigate our lives without our own children as a family. No doubt there are all sorts of tensions that a marriage comes under when you get that sort of news and when you're negotiating the future together. How do you think you can easily, and maybe easily is not a good word, but effectively begin that sort of negotiation to say, we've got a different calling, things are different for us? How's that worked for you and Merrin?
Yeah. Oh, that's a huge area because you have the negotiation to do within yourselves as a couple because there are so many things to negotiate. I would have been happy to have drawn our journey for a child to an end 5 years earlier than Merrin. And so our conversations had to grapple with the fact that I was more than happy to wind this thing up and Merrin wanted to keep on going. Couples will face questions like, well, should we do IVF or not? Do we feel that that's okay for us as Christians to use? And as you know, Merrin and I did try IVF We worked. We did it in a way that we thought was ethically okay. We did not lose any life in the process of that. Other couples will look at that and actually come to a different perspective on that and say, no, I don't want to go down that path. Should we try fostering and adoption? If so, how long do we try? How many rounds of IVF do we try? So many decisions, Neil, and the amount of times that Marion and I just had to stay on that couch in the lounge room and talk it through and pray it through, sometimes not even coming to an agreement after we'd prayed it through, which was very rare for us. Keep on talking, keep on sacrificing. I did a whole bunch of things that I didn't really want to do for the sake of Marion. She did a bunch of things that she didn't really want to do for my sake. And that's just what marriage is a part of. And then when it comes to negotiating, well, life without children, if that's the calling that happens for you, again, many couples, that is not the case. You will get a child one way or another, whether it's through some sort of medical means or whether it's through a miraculous answer to prayer or whether it's through fostering adoption. But if then it is, you've then got to negotiate, well, how do we live our life now? What are the things that we want to do? What do we have the freedom now to do? Well, we've got the freedom to go on holidays outside of school holiday times. We can go on the cheaper times. We can go on the off-season times. That's great. We've got the freedom to travel. We've got the freedom to serve and minister, just like the Apostle Paul was talking about. So you can talk about those things. You can talk about your secondary dreams. You can talk about your consolation prizes. That's what was really key for Marion and me, talking through a consolation prize for Marion in particular. And for her, that was moving over to another country and starting life afresh.
And I know that one of your devotions actually highlights 5 opportunities that come beyond getting that news that you're not able to have children. And thank you so much, Sheridan, for sharing a man's perspective on this. As we started out in our conversation, we said all the attention usually goes to the woman who's not able to have a child, but to be able to get a focus today on the man and his emotional roller coaster ride and all of the challenges that come to manhood. But so beautifully put when you say Jesus, who at the age of 33 was single and childless. We all aspire in our identity to be like him. The book is called Praying Through Infertility, and it's not just a book for women, it's a book for couples, a 90-day devotional for men and women. And it's just been released. It's available when you go online. You'll find it at online booksellers. To connect with Sheridan Voysey, the author, SheridanVoysey.com, SheridanVoysey.com. But you might want to get a hold of it. Praying Through Infertility, a 90-day devotional for men and women. Each day, a devotional includes a scripture verse and prayer, and there's an inspirational story where fears and anger are transformed into confident expectation and pure worship. SheridanVoysey.com. Sheridan, thank you so much for sharing your heart with us once again today on 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.